The night air was thick with the scent of rain as Peter Parker swung through the towering maze of Manhattan, the familiar whine of the web shooters cutting through the city's hum. This was the night it was supposed to end. The night Norman Osborn, the Green Goblin, would meet his fate. In the original path, the one Peter would have sworn was inevitable, Norman would be impaled by his own glider, his legacy collapsing in a final, bitter act of self-destruction. But in this timeline, Peter's reflexes, driven by a surge of instinct and mercy, caught the incoming blade in time. The metal fangs of the glider were mere inches from Norman's chest when Peter wrenched the weapon away, forcing it to crash harmlessly against the brick wall. The goblin, caught off guard, found himself disarmed and wrapped in Peter's webbing before he could recover. The mask was torn away, revealing Norman's strained, sweat-drenched face. His voice cracked in a way Peter had never heard before as he whispered, I don't want to die, Peter. Please. Minutes later, the Osborn mansion loomed like a silent sentinel against the dark skyline. Peter dragged the unconscious Norman through the window and laid him in the study, the fire casting long shadows across the walls, lined with antique weapons and corporate awards. He heard footsteps, quick and alarmed. Harry Osborn burst into the room, freezing as he saw his father bound in webbing. His eyes darted between Norman's pale face and the figure in red and blue crouched beside him. "What did you do to him?" Harry demanded, his voice trembling. Peter hesitated, searching for words, but none came. Instead, he shot a final look at Norman, then vaulted through the window and into the night. Behind him, Harry rushed to his father's side, and that was when Norman, still dazed, muttered his confession. About the goblin, about his mistakes. Tears followed quickly. He swore to Harry that he would change, that the madness was behind him. For Harry, it was a night of revelation and confusion, not hatred. Spider-Man hadn't killed his father. He'd saved him. 2 years passed, but the shadow of that night never left any of them. Norman returned to the public eye as the rehabilitated patriarch of Oscorp, carefully crafting a new image. His speeches were calculated, his charm restored, his business acumen sharper than ever. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a constant tension, an unspoken acknowledgement between Norman and Peter. Norman's memories of Spider-Man's true identity had faded into a murky haze, as if locked away by some defensive mechanism of his mind. But the memory of the goblin was not gone. It lingered like a phantom limb, a voice that sometimes whispered from the corners of his thoughts. Oscorp thrived under his leadership, securing military contracts and unveiling ambitious scientific projects. Among them was the work of Dr. Otto Octavius, a brilliant yet prideful physicist, determined to harness the power of sustained fusion. Peter's life, however, was not thriving. The struggle to balance school, his photography job, and the relentless demands of being Spider-Man weighed on him more heavily than ever. Every late assignment, every missed bill, and every disappointed glance from Aunt May felt like another brick added to the load on his shoulders. His relationship with MJ had grown distant, and now she was seeing John Jameson, a confident, successful astronaut whose smile seemed to fit more naturally in her life than Peter's endless apologies. Even Harry, still his closest friend, was slipping away into a haze of late-night parties, drinking, and reckless spending. Without the responsibility of Oscorp on his shoulders, Harry had leaned into the aimless privileges of wealth, his easy charm slowly curdling into bitterness when life didn't bend to his whims. The day of Octavius's big demonstration arrived, drawing a crowd of investors, scientists, and media to Oscorp's high-tech laboratory. Norman was there, flanked by his board members, his presence a reminder to Otto of who controlled the purse strings. The demonstration began much like the one Peter had imagined in his head from science magazines and lectures. Otto spoke with the confidence of a man who believed himself untouchable, introducing his invention with poetic flair. The mechanical arms, glinting under the lights, attached themselves to his spine with a surgical precision that made even seasoned scientists shift uncomfortably. Peter, standing in the back as part of the press, felt a flicker of unease. He remembered the way Norman had once looked at power, hungry, almost worshipful, and saw a similar gleam in Otto's eyes. When the fusion reaction began, the air seemed to vibrate with heat and promise. But as Peter knew it would, the dream soured quickly. The containment field faltered. Sparks danced dangerously close to the crowd. Otto's voice rose, panicked, but the arms moved independently now, locking him in place. Peter ducked away, changed into Spider-Man, and leapt into action, tearing cables and smashing controls until the reactor sputtered and died. The room was chaos, shattered glass, the hiss of ruptured pipes. Otto slumped and unconscious. Norman, watching from behind a wall of Oscorp security, didn't rush to his friend's side. He studied him, calculating. This wasn't just a setback, it was a liability. In the official story given to the press, Otto was injured during an equipment malfunction and was being cared for at a secure location. In truth, Otto woke days later under the grip of the mechanical arms, his pride inflamed by Norman's cold dismissal. Oscorp was no longer a partner, it was an obstacle. While Norman and Otto moved toward inevitable conflict, Peter's own world frayed further. Rent notices piled up, his grades slipped. He missed another of MJ's performances, seeing her afterward in the arms of John Jameson. Aunt May tried to hide her own struggles, but the mortgage on her home was falling behind. And through it all, the people of New York continued to expect Spider-Man to swing in and save the day, no matter the cost to the man behind the mask. Peter's back ached from endless nights on patrol. His web fluid cartridges drained faster than he could afford to replace them. Each rescue seemed to take more out of him. And there were moments, short, terrifying moments, when his grip on the web slipped, his leaps fell short, his vision blurred. He was starting to lose his powers, and he didn't understand why. It was during one of these faltering nights that he found himself sitting alone on a rooftop, mask in his lap, the city stretching endlessly beneath him. Uncle Ben's voice echoed in his mind, the lesson about responsibility, but the words were starting to feel like a weight he couldn't bear. Somewhere below, Norman Osborn was playing the role of the city's benefactor, funding science in the name of progress. Somewhere else, Harry was laughing in a dimly lit bar, surrounded by people who didn't know or care what he'd been through. And somewhere in the shadows, Otto Octavius was beginning to plan his return, the arms whispering promises of control and revenge. Rain fell in a light, constant drizzle over the city, blurring the neon signs and dim streetlights as Peter walked home from another late shift. His clothes clung to him, heavy with water and fatigue. The weight in his chest had grown unbearable in recent weeks, not just from the exhaustion, but from the strange creeping unreliability of his powers. Web lines missed their mark. His swings came up short. Some days, he woke with blurred vision, unable to focus through the lenses of his mask. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but a quiet dread gnawed at him. Somewhere deep inside, Peter wondered if this was his body telling him to stop, telling him it had reached its limit. Meanwhile, Norman Osborn's public image as a savior of science was beginning to crack in the privacy of his home. Harry saw it first, the quiet moments when his father would stare too long at nothing, his hand twitching slightly as if responding to some invisible voice. Norman denied it, brushing Harry's concerns away with a chuckle and a drink. But when the goblin persona spoke to him in the mirror late at night, Norman didn't feel the horror he once did. He felt invigorated. Otto's betrayal had cut deep. Oscorp's golden project had turned into a liability, and Norman's pride demanded retribution. Still, he kept his distance, letting Otto roam, certain the man's arrogance would drive him into a corner eventually. Otto Octavius, however, was not cornered. The accident had stripped him of patience and fear, leaving only a burning obsession. The arms whispered strategies, solutions. They encouraged him to stop asking permission and take what he needed. Oscorp's facilities became his hunting grounds. He ripped tritium from storage rooms, dismantled labs, and hijacked experimental equipment. It was during one of these raids that Spider-Man tried to stop him, and failed. Peter's powers faltered mid-fight, his grip loosening on a web line that should have restrained Otto. He fell hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, and by the time he recovered, Otto was gone. The humiliation stung almost as much as the bruises. In the midst of this chaos, life continued to close in on Peter from every direction. Aunt May, sitting across from him in the car one quiet afternoon, told him about the mortgage in a voice that trembled more with shame than fear. It reminded Peter of another quiet drive years ago, the day Uncle Ben's words changed his life. But now, instead of being inspired, Peter felt like he was drowning in a tide of expectations he could never meet. That night, after failing once again to be there for MJ, he made the decision that had been looming for weeks. He folded the red and blue suit carefully, placed it in a garbage can in an alley, and walked away. The next morning, a man found it and delivered it to the Daily Bugle. The headline screamed across every newsstand, "Spider-Man no more." The city's crime rate climbed almost instantly. Robberies, assaults, and gang activity surged in the absence of its masked protector. Norman noticed. The goblin inside him noticed even more. Without Spider-Man to act as a counterbalance, men like Otto could thrive. For a brief moment, Norman considered suiting up again, claiming the streets in the goblin's name. But the thought of slipping so easily into that madness frightened him. Instead, he tightened Oscorp's security and began tracking Otto's movements, preparing for a confrontation that felt inevitable. MJ's engagement to John Jameson was announced at a glittering gala. Peter attended in silence, watching from a corner as she laughed in John's arms. Harry, drunk and restless, wandered between guests, making biting remarks that revealed his growing cynicism. In a rare private moment, Harry told Peter he was thinking of leaving the city altogether. "There's nothing here for me anymore," he said, swirling the drink in his glass. "My father's obsessed with Oscorp. MJ's marrying someone else, and you're always somewhere else." Peter tried to reassure him, but Harry only smirked bitterly before walking away. The breaking point came when Otto stormed into one of Oscorp's secondary labs, demanding more tritium for his fusion reactor. Norman confronted him, trying to assert control. That's when Otto made his play. He told Norman that he knew about the Green Goblin, that he could expose him to the world in a heartbeat. When Norman refused to yield, Otto struck hard, his mechanical arms tearing through security like paper. He left the lab in flames and took 2 prizes with him. Mary Jane Watson, plucked from her walk home after rehearsal, and Harry Osborn, snatched from the bar where he'd been drowning his frustrations. Peter was at his lowest when Norman found him. The 2 men met in a darkened Oscorp boardroom, the blinds drawn against the city lights. Norman didn't waste time. He laid out everything. His memory of Peter as Spider-Man, his knowledge that Otto had taken Harry and MJ, and his belief that only they, together, could stop him. Peter hesitated, the weight of his recent failures pressing on him, but the thought of MJ and Otto's grip, of Harry suffering because of his inaction, broke through his self-doubt. The suit was waiting for him in his closet, still smelling faintly of rain and city smoke. That night, the streets saw something they had never seen before. Spider-Man swinging alongside the Green Goblin. Norman's armor was different now, sleeker, darker, less flamboyant than before. His glider cut through the air in sharp, efficient arcs, every movement calculated for war. Peter didn't trust him. Not fully, but for the first time in 2 years, he wasn't alone. Somewhere in the distance, at the edge of the pier, the faint hum of Otto's reactor could be heard beneath the crash of waves. The final confrontation was coming. The pier was shrouded in a damp, low fog, the kind that clung to the skin and made the sodium lights along the waterfront glow like muted embers. Waves slapped rhythmically against the rotting pylons, but beneath that natural rhythm was a deeper sound, the steady mechanical thrum of Otto Octavius's reactor. It was louder now, pulsing like the heartbeat of some alien creature, and with every beat the water shimmered faintly, as if pulled by the machine's growing gravitational field. From above, Spider-Man swung low, his eyes fixed on the silhouette of the warehouse that loomed at the pier's edge. A moment later, the familiar whine of Norman's glider cut through the mist, weaving tightly beside him. They didn't speak. The time for words was over. Both men knew what was at stake, and both carried private doubts about whether they could truly trust the other. For Peter, Norman's past loomed over every calculated move, every too-sharp grin. For Norman, the Goblin's voice was a constant hiss in the back of his mind, whispering that Peter would leave him to die if the moment demanded it. Inside the warehouse was a cathedral of industry. The reactor stood in the center, its glowing core suspended in a skeletal frame of metal and wires. The 4 long arms attached to Otto's back curled and twitched like restless predators, their claws sparking as they worked on the containment field. MJ and Harry were bound on opposite sides of the machine, their eyes wide with fear. Otto moved between them with deliberate steps, his voice a low growl as he murmured to himself, fine-tuning his calculations. The attack began without warning. A cable snapped from above, yanking Otto backward as Spider-Man dropped into the fray, his momentum carrying him into a solid kick that sent the scientist staggering. In the same heartbeat, Norman swept in on the glider, hurling a pair of pumpkin bombs that exploded in precise bursts, severing key power lines. Sparks cascaded in showers of gold and white. Otto roared, his arms lashing out wildly, one nearly cleaving Norman from his perch. The glider dipped dangerously, scraping the floor before Norman regained control, looping back for another pass. The fight was chaos. Otto's arms moved with terrifying intelligence, blocking Peter's web shots and swatting him aside like an insect. Norman strafed the floor with razor-sharp blades from the glider, forcing Otto to split his attention. Peter used every opening he could find, swinging between the reactor's supports, ricocheting off steel beams, to strike at the inhibitor chip on Otto's neck. Each time he got close, a claw would slam into his ribs, or sweep his legs out from under him, sending him skidding across the concrete. Harry's voice cut through the din. "Dad, watch out." Norman turned just in time to see a claw slicing toward him. The glider jolted upward, but the strike caught his armor along the side, tearing a deep gash. The Goblin's voice rose in his head, urging him to fight without restraint, to kill Otto before he could kill them. Norman's breathing quickened, his attacks growing more savage. Pumpkin bombs detonated in rapid succession, filling the air with acrid smoke. Peter shouted for him to keep the reactor stable, but Norman wasn't listening anymore. Otto saw his chance and drove a claw straight into Norman's glider, sending it spinning out of control. Norman hit the ground hard, the wind knocked from him. Otto loomed over him, claws poised to end it, until Peter intercepted, swinging down with a kick that knocked Otto aside. "Get them out," Peter barked, nodding toward MJ and Harry. Norman hesitated, torn between obeying and finishing the fight. Finally, with a snarl, he slashed through MJ's bonds and shoved her toward the exit. Harry was next, though his eyes were locked on his father in a mix of shock and fear. The reactor's hum deepened, the light from its core growing blindingly bright. Peter knew they were running out of time. He tangled Otto in webs, pinning his arms to the floor, but the mechanical limbs tore through the bindings like paper. One claw snapped toward Peter's throat, and he felt the cold metal graze his skin before Norman's glider slammed into Otto's side, knocking him clear. For a fleeting moment, Peter saw something in Norman's expression, pure, unfiltered rage. But it wasn't aimed at him. Together they struck. Peter disoriented Otto with a rapid barrage of web shots to his sensors, while Norman dove low, skewering the floor with his glider's blade and forcing Otto into the reactor's frame. Sparks erupted. One of Otto's claws jammed into the containment field's controls, freezing them in place. The reactor sputtered, its light dimming just enough for Peter to shut it down, with a final wrenching pull on the main conduit. The sudden silence was deafening. Otto lay panting, restrained by layers of webbing and damaged machinery. His eyes burned with defiance. "This city deserves me," he spat, his voice thick with venom. Peter said nothing, stepping back as Oscorp security, summoned by Norman, flooded the room. The guards moved to take Otto away, but he never broke his gaze from Peter. Outside, the night air felt heavier somehow, the fog swallowing the pier, as if eager to erase what had just happened. MJ clung to Peter for a brief moment, before John Jameson arrived to pull her away. Harry stood beside his father, still processing the sight of Norman in the goblin armor, though Norman brushed it off as necessary for the mission. Back at Oscorp, Norman stood in his private office, staring at the goblin mask resting on his desk. His reflection stared back from the polished surface of its green brow. And for a long time he didn't move. In the reflection's eyes, the goblin's smirk seemed just a little too real, a little too alive. In the city jail, Otto sat in a reinforced cell, his mechanical arms locked in place by heavy restraints. He didn't look up when a shadow approached the bars. A small container slid through the opening. Inside it, a slick black substance that pulsed faintly, as though alive. The shadow's voice was low, almost conspiratorial. "This will give you all the power you need." Otto's lips curled into the faintest of smiles. The game wasn't over. Autumn crept into New York with a cold, biting wind that seemed to carry the tension of the past months through every street and alley. The city still buzzed about the Pier incident, though the details had been scrubbed clean by Oscorp's PR machine. Officially, it was a rogue scientist apprehended during an industrial accident. Unofficially, whispers about Spider-Man and a mysterious armored figure working together had already taken root in backroom conversations and late-night radio shows. Peter walked home through the narrowing days, the world around him feeling oddly heavier. The victory at the pier should have felt like a triumph, but it hadn't. Otto was alive, captured, but alive. And Peter couldn't shake the feeling that the man wasn't done. The black substance he'd glimpsed in that cell haunted his dreams, even though he'd told himself it was just another Oscorp experiment. His relationship with MJ was no less tangled than before. She still wore John Jameson's engagement ring, and though there were moments, small glances, half-finished sentences, that hinted at something unresolved between them, Peter kept his distance. Harry, on the other hand, had become more of a stranger with each passing day. The kidnapping had shaken him, but what had really taken root in his mind was the sight of his father in the goblin armor. Norman had explained it away as emergency protection, a necessity in a dangerous situation. But Harry had seen the way his father moved, the way he fought. It wasn't just protection, it was something more primal, more practiced. At night, Harry would drink alone in the Osborn penthouse, staring out over the city and wondering how much of his life had been built on lies. Norman himself stood at the edge of a precipice he could feel, but not quite see. The goblin persona was back, whispering in his ear at board meetings, mocking him when he shook hands with politicians, laughing when he caught sight of himself in the mirror. Some nights, Norman would open the secret compartment in his study and stare at the mask, the curved grin glinting in the low light. He told himself he was keeping it for emergencies. The goblin told him he was keeping it because he missed the rush, far from Oscorp's polished towers, in the isolation of a maximum security facility. Otto Octavius sat in silence, the restraints on his arms digging into his skin. His cell was dim, the air stale. In the corner, on a small steel tray, the container of black shifting matter pulsed like a living heart. It had no voice, yet Otto could feel it calling to him, promising strength, clarity, and the means to finish what he had started. In the glass of the cell door, his reflection flickered for a moment, longer, broader, darker than himself, before settling back to normal. The city slept on, unaware of the fractures spreading through the lives of its so-called saviors and its hidden threats. Spider-Man had saved the day, but in the shadows the next storm was already building, and when it broke, it would be unlike anything Peter Parker had faced before. The wind off the Hudson was sharp that night, biting through Peter Parker's jacket as he made his way home from a late patrol. Months had passed since the battle at the Pier, yet the city felt no safer. New York was always restless, always shifting, but now there was something else. Something calculated behind the chaos. The papers reported a surge of coordinated robberies. Tech shipments hijacked, Oscorp labs stripped bare in the middle of the night, and power substations sabotaged with surgical precision. At first, Peter thought it might be one of the usual suspects. Shocker, maybe Vulture, but the pattern was too clean, too organized. Someone was pulling strings, and the city was feeling the strain. Otto Octavius was supposed to be locked away for good. The Pier battle had left him bloodied, restrained, and under heavy Oscorp security. But Oscorp's public face, the official line, was that he was under rehabilitation. The truth was that he was being held in a private facility with enough resources to tempt even the most moral of men. And Otto was far from moral now. In the dim, cold light of his cell, he had spent weeks studying the shifting black mass left to him by a mysterious benefactor. It spoke without words, responding to his thoughts, flowing between his fingers like liquid shadow. When it finally bonded to him, the pain was unbearable. And then it was gone, replaced by a clarity of purpose he had never known. The tentacles became more than steel. They were alive, slick with alien muscle, bending and snapping with a speed that made his old movements look sluggish. The symbiote whispered promises of control, domination, perfection. Otto listened. While the criminal underworld reorganized itself under this unseen hand, Peter tried to rebuild what little normalcy he could. His job at the Bugle was as thankless as ever. J. Jonah Jameson capitalizing on Spider-Man's every misstep to fill headlines. MJ was deep in rehearsals for a new stage role, her days and nights swallowed up by the demands of the production. Peter was proud of her, but the distance between them was growing again, subtle but unmistakable. Harry was quieter than usual, spending more time at the Osborn penthouse, ostensibly to help his father with Oscorp's expansion, though Peter suspected his friend's late nights had more to do with whiskey than business. It was during a particularly long shift at the Bugle that Detective George Stacy approached Peter. The older man slid a thin folder across the desk, his voice low. "We've reopened your uncle's case. New evidence points to a suspect we missed." Inside were photographs of a tall, broad-shouldered man with a gaunt face, Flint Marco. Fingerprints matched those found at the scene of the carjacking that ended in Ben Parker's death. Peter stared at the images, his stomach twisting. All this time, he had believed the killer was the man who'd fallen from that warehouse years ago. The memory of that night, the guilt, the rage, had driven so much of his life. Now it was all shifting under his feet. Peter didn't tell Aunt May, not yet. He needed answers first. He tracked Marco's movements, trailing him across rooftops and shadowed alleys. Marco was no supervillain, just a man trying to survive. But there was a heaviness in his posture, a tension that made Peter think he was always running from something. The confrontation came in a deserted rail yard. Peter cornered him, demanded the truth. Marco's eyes flickered with recognition, then shame. He admitted to being there that night, but insisted it wasn't intentional. He'd been scared, desperate, and the gun went off by accident. "I'm sorry," Marco said, voice breaking. "If I could take it back." The words did nothing to ease the knot in Peter's chest. Meanwhile, in the highest floors of Oscorp, Norman Osborn was playing his own game. The memory of the Green Goblin had returned to him in full color, but this time, he wasn't letting it consume him in bursts of violent mania. This time, he was patient. The Goblin persona was no longer an intruder. It was a partner, whispering strategies instead of taunts. Norman began making quiet moves, buying influence among the city's crime families, recruiting mercenaries, striking deals with suppliers the police didn't even know existed. He envisioned himself as something more than the Green Goblin, something grander, the Goblin King. A ruler not of boardrooms, but of the streets, the gangs, the black market. Peter noticed the ripple effects of Norman's moves without realizing their source. Criminal factions were uniting in strange ways, old rivals suddenly working together. The streets felt tense, as if the city was holding its breath. And through it all, Otto's presence remained invisible but palpable. Each week, another high-tech component vanished, another lab was gutted, another Oscorp delivery truck disappeared. One night, after a fruitless patrol, Peter stood on a rooftop watching the glow of the city. In the distance, a convoy of armored trucks moved in perfect formation, down a deserted street, flanked by men armed with weapons too advanced for common thugs. The convoy turned toward the old industrial district, a part of the city Peter hadn't set foot in since the Pier. Somewhere in the shadows of those warehouses, he knew Otto Octavius was building something. And if the whispers on the street were true, Norman Osborn might already be on his way to see it for himself. The first hints of Otto's reach came in the form of whispers. Warehouse workers speaking of spider machines scuttling along walls, vanishing before the cops arrived. Power outages hitting only specific blocks. Those same neighborhoods later crawling with new gangs armed to the teeth. Peter was already stretched thin, trying to track Marco's movements, but he couldn't ignore the pattern. This wasn't random crime. It was a net, being cast slowly, deliberately over the city, and its center was somewhere in the industrial district, that forgotten stretch of brick and steel that had once been the beating heart of New York's shipping lanes. Peter's investigation took him there on a moonless night, the streets empty except for the faint hum of electricity bleeding from somewhere above. Climbing to a rooftop, he saw it. Drones, dozens of them, scuttling across a building's glass like insects. Their movements were unnervingly organic, the metallic legs flexing with alien smoothness. He followed them, keeping to the shadows until they disappeared into a structure that looked more like a living organism than a warehouse. Black tar-like veins pulsed across its steel skeleton, weaving in and out of machinery. Peter's stomach tightened. The symbiote. Otto wasn't just wearing it, he was feeding it into his machines, merging alien biology with his mechanical genius. Inside, Otto stood in the glow of a massive central hub, his arms moving with liquid speed as they interfaced with holographic schematics. The symbiote had warped them beyond recognition. They were no longer just metal appendages, but living extensions of Otto himself, each tipped with claws that dripped faint black strands like oil. He spoke softly to the symbiote, almost tenderly, as if it were an accomplice rather than a tool. Soon, every camera, every drone, every circuit in this city will be mine. No more chaos, no more weakness, only order. Across town, Norman Osborn was making moves of his own. Meetings were held in dim backrooms where cigar smoke and low voices filled the air. One by one, he brought the city's gang leaders to heel, offering protection, weapons, and the promise of territory once Otto's growing shadow was erased. But Norman didn't see Otto merely as an enemy. He saw him as an opportunity. If the symbiote was as powerful as rumored, and if Otto had truly mastered it, then it was something Norman could take. The goblin whispered in his mind, urging him to strike now, to seize power before Otto's grip was unshakable. But Norman held back, waiting for the right moment. Harry, meanwhile, had begun to notice the changes in his father. The late nights, the sudden bursts of temper, the way he seemed sharper, more dangerous. He confided in Peter, admitting he'd seen strange armored figures entering Oscorp after hours. Peter listened but said little. Too much of his mind was already consumed by Marco and Otto. And then, as if the universe knew he was nearing his breaking point, Marco came to him. It happened in an alley behind a convenience store, Marco's rough voice echoing off the bricks. "I didn't mean to kill him," he said, hands raised. "It was a mistake. I was scared." Peter's fists clenched, but so hard his knuckles ached under the suit. Every instinct screamed at him to hit Marco, to make him pay for the years of guilt and grief. But Marco didn't fight back. He stood there, waiting, almost daring Peter to do it. Peter left without a word, swinging into the night, but the encounter left him raw, his thoughts spiraling. Had everything he'd done as Spider-Man been built on a lie? Otto and Norman finally crossed paths under the cold fluorescence of an abandoned Oscorp lab. Their meeting began as a negotiation, Otto offering Norman a place in his new order, Norman countering with promises of mutual power. But neither man trusted the other. Otto saw Norman as an old relic, a man past his prime. Norman saw Otto as a parasite hiding behind stolen technology. They agreed to an uneasy alliance. Norman's criminal networks would give Otto the manpower he needed, and Otto's hive would provide Norman with unprecedented surveillance over the city. But even as they shook hands, both were already imagining the other's death. The alliance didn't last long. At a public tech expo hosted by Oscorp, Otto made his move. Emerging from the shadows like a mechanical spider god, his symbiote-coated arms lashed out, tearing through displays and sending the crowd into a panic. Norman, dressed in his tailored CEO's suit, barely escaped as one of Otto's claws crushed the stage where he'd been standing. The attack wasn't just a betrayal, it was a declaration. Otto no longer needed Norman. He had his own army now, and his hive was spreading faster than anyone could stop it. That night, Peter swung across rooftops, watching the city transform. Blocks went dark as Otto's drones severed power lines. Police scanners reported entire precincts under siege. The skyline glowed with the faint pulsing veins of the hive, creeping up buildings like ivy. In the midst of it all, Norman disappeared from the public eye. Peter knew what that meant. Somewhere in the depths of the Osborn estate, the Goblin was being reborn. Not as the fractured madman he'd once been, but as something worse, something patient, something ready to rule. By the week's end, New York was no longer a city in tension. It was a city at war. The war began before dawn. The first sirens blared just after 4 a.m., the echo of explosions rolling across the East River. By sunrise, the city was already choking on smoke. Otto's hive had erupted in full force. Symbiote-infused drones skittered along power lines and across rooftops, slicing through cables, shutting down traffic signals, plunging entire neighborhoods into darkness. Police helicopters circled helplessly above as swarms of black, glistening machines leapt from building to building, dismantling their rotors mid-air. Otto's voice broadcast across hijacked radio frequencies, calm and commanding, promising a new age of order for New York, one where weakness and chaos would be designed out of existence. But Otto wasn't the only one making his move. From the shadowed alleys and abandoned docks, Norman's army poured into the streets. His Goblin Guard rode modified gliders, smaller, faster, bristling with weapons. Street gangs loyal to Norman marched under his banner, their firepower unmatched by the NYPD. In the skies above Midtown, the Goblin himself soared, clad in newly forged armor that merged the sleek lines of his original suit with jagged, almost crown-like details. This was no longer the manic Green Goblin who had taunted Spider-Man years ago. This was the Goblin King, and he was here to claim the city. Peter swung through the chaos. Every corner a battlefield. Below, Otto's drones and Norman's troops clashed in brutal skirmishes, explosions blooming like dark flowers in the early morning haze. Above, Norman strafed the hive's outposts, sending goblin bombs into their pulsating black structures. Peter tried to intervene where he could, webbing up a collapsing building to save civilians, disarming a rooftop shootout. But the scale of the war made it impossible to be everywhere at once. He was one man in the middle of two titans carving up New York. In the midst of the fighting, Peter tracked the hive's expansion back to its heart, a sprawling biomechanical structure grafted into the steel bones of the Queensboro Bridge. The hive had transformed the bridge into a monstrous organism, symbiote tendrils wrapped around its suspension cables, pulsing with sickly light, while massive generators hummed beneath the roadway. This was Otto's nest, the nerve center from which he controlled the entire swarm. Peter knew that if he could take it down, the city might stand a chance, but getting there meant going through both Otto and Norman. At the bridge's midpoint, a brutal three-way battle erupted. Otto descended from the upper scaffolding, his symbiote-coated arms snapping out in arcs that sliced through steel. Norman swooped in from above, his glider weaving between the cables, launching a barrage of razor bats that forced Otto back. Peter tried to get close to the core, but the fight was a storm of claws, bombs, and webs. One of Otto's arms lashed out, sending Peter sprawling across the bridge, the taste of blood sharp in his mouth. "Stay out of this, Parker," Otto snarled, the symbiote rippling over his face like a second skin. "You can't stop progress." From behind, Norman's voice cut in, dripping with scorn. "Progress. You've built a cage, Octavius, and I'll be the one holding the key." The battle escalated into something almost surreal. Otto's arms smashing through Goblin Guard gliders, Norman's bombs detonating in bursts of green flame against the hive's tendrils. Peter fought both in moments, webbing a claw here, deflecting a pumpkin bomb there, trying to keep the destruction from collapsing the bridge entirely. And then, through the smoke and chaos, Peter saw him, Flint Marko, caught between fleeing civilians and a collapsing section of roadway. A stray blast from Otto's drones had set the asphalt crumbling beneath him. Peter's mind flashed back to the alley, to Marko's voice trembling as he admitted the truth. The man who had taken Uncle Ben's life, whether by accident or not, was now about to die in front of him. He had seconds to choose: chase Otto and stop the hive, or save Marko. Peter saved him. Webbing Marko to safety, Peter turned back just in time to see Otto retreat into the hive's core. Norman hot on his trail. Peter followed them inside, the structure's walls closing in with living, oily muscle. At the center, the symbiote pooled around Otto like a throne, his arms striking faster than Peter had ever seen. Norman attacked from the air, but Otto caught the glider mid-flight, slamming it into the wall. The symbiote surged toward Norman, eager for a new host, but Peter acted fast, webbing the glider's sonic systems and cranking them to maximum. The screech ripped through the chamber, the symbiote shrieking as it peeled away from Otto's body. Otto fell to his knees, the human beneath the monster revealed for just a moment before he was dragged away by the collapsing hive's tendrils. The symbiote slithered into the shadows, disappearing into the cracks of the bridge's structure. Norman, battered but alive, glared at Peter. "This isn't over," he growled, before launching himself out of the collapsing nest. Peter barely made it out before the entire hive imploded, chunks of the bridge crashing into the river below. The city would survive, but it was scarred, its skyline altered, its streets stained with the remnants of war. In the days that followed, the Goblin King's forces went underground, waiting for the next opportunity. Otto was nowhere to be found, though Peter suspected the man was still alive somewhere, licking his wounds. And Marko disappeared too, his fate uncertain. One evening, Peter stood at Uncle Ben's grave, the sounds of the city distant and muffled. "It wasn't about revenge," he whispered. "It never was. It's about what I choose to do, every single day." Far above, on a distant rooftop, Norman Osborn watched through the green glow of his visor. The city was still his for the taking, and soon he would take it all. The East River was quiet, its black waters rippling under the pull of the tide. High above, the city's skyline was a jagged silhouette against the faint glow of the horizon. The early morning stillness almost enough to make Peter Parker believe New York was finally at peace. Almost. Beneath the surface, something moved. It drifted with the current, a slick pulsing shadow, twisting in ways that defied the natural flow of water. It clung to debris, riding broken pieces of steel and concrete, until it found the opening of a storm drain. From there, it followed the pipes upward, the thrum of the city growing louder with each bend. Eventually, it spilled out into the shadows of a half-built skyscraper in Midtown. A lone Oscorp security guard made his rounds, his flashlight cutting thin beams through the dusty air. He didn't notice the shadow crawling along the wall, didn't hear the wet slap of it dropping behind him, until it struck. The black mass engulfed him in seconds, his scream swallowed as the symbiote took hold. When he rose again, the beam of his flashlight lay shattered on the floor, and his eyes gleamed with a predatory hunger. Elsewhere, the city was still healing from the war on the Queensboro Bridge. Street crews patched the scars on the roads. Construction teams reinforced weakened buildings, and the NYPD cleared away the remnants of Otto Octavius's hive. But beneath the surface, the victory was fragile. Norman Osborn's criminal empire had not crumbled. It had merely gone to ground. In abandoned warehouses, derelict subway stations, and shuttered factories, his Goblin Guard regrouped, training with military precision under his orders. Norman kept himself out of sight, appearing only in public when it benefited him, wearing the mask of the benevolent CEO. Behind closed doors, though, the Goblin King whispered in his mind, reminding him that the city was his to claim. Peter had been running himself ragged in the weeks since the bridge. Without Otto's hive dominating the headlines, crime had returned to its usual chaotic rhythm. But it felt different now. More organized in certain neighborhoods, more violent in others. He could feel Norman's influence even without proof, like a hand pressing against the city from the shadows. His personal life was no better. Things with MJ were strained. They spoke when they could, but the unspoken tension between them lingered. She'd seen too much in the past year to pretend she didn't understand the risks of being with him, and he could tell she was weighing whether she could handle a life built around constant danger. Harry was distant too. He'd been spending more time away from Peter, showing up late to work at Oscorp, and disappearing on weekends without explanation. When Peter asked about it, Harry brushed him off, saying only that he was figuring things out. Peter could guess what that meant. Harry was still wrestling with the truth about his father and the Goblin, and sooner or later, that would bring them to a confrontation neither of them wanted. Then came the first killing. A small-time enforcer for one of Norman's rival gangs was found in a back alley, his body twisted unnaturally, the asphalt around him scarred with deep, claw-like gouges. At first, Peter thought it was a random gang hit, but the reports kept coming. A police officer patrolling near the docks. A private security team guarding an Oscorp shipment. Even Hermann Schultz, the shocker, turned up in a hospital bed, with injuries so severe the doctors couldn't say if he'd ever walk again. Witnesses spoke of a figure moving like liquid shadow, its black skin glinting under the streetlights, its shape constantly shifting. Peter's stomach dropped. He had seen this before, at the bridge when the symbiote had torn itself free from Otto. He'd watched it vanish into the night, too exhausted to give chase. Now it was back, and it had found a new host. Determined to find it before it spread further, Peter tracked the killings, looking for patterns. They all formed a loose circle around Midtown, like the creature was protecting territory. His search led him to a construction site late one night, the skeletal frame of a skyscraper looming overhead. The air was thick with dust and the smell of wet concrete. He landed silently on an upper beam, his eyes scanning the shadows. A flicker of movement caught his attention. The host stepped into the light, a man in a shredded Oscorp security uniform, his face hidden under the black sheen of the symbiote. The moment their eyes met, the creature lunged, moving faster than Peter could react. The fight was unlike anything he'd faced before. The symbiote gave the man an unpredictable fluid strength, his limbs twisting in ways that made his attacks impossible to read. Peter's punches landed but felt like they sank into water, absorbed and redirected. The creature's counterblows rattled Peter to his core, the force behind them almost inhuman. Only when a support beam collapsed between them did the creature retreat, melting back into the shadows of the site. Peter stood alone in the dust, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He knew now without a doubt, this wasn't just another fight. This was the beginning of something worse. And somewhere in the city, Norman Osborn was watching all of it unfold, calculating how to make the symbiote his. Rain slicked the streets of Manhattan, turning neon signs into warped reflections in the puddles. Somewhere above, Peter clung to the side of a building, watching an Oscorp convoy roll down the avenue. The trucks were armored, their engines rumbling low, and Peter knew they weren't transporting anything ordinary. He'd been tracking Oscorp's late-night shipments for weeks. Illegal weapons, unlicensed tech, all slipping under the radar. This convoy wasn't just another move in Norman's power play. It was bait. Peter could see it in the way the Goblin Guard's gliders shadowed the trucks from the rooftops, their movements crisp and rehearsed. Norman wanted the symbiote to come to him, and it did. From the mouth of a dark alley, the symbiote host emerged, the black suit glistening under the streetlights. It moved low and fast, a blur of shifting muscle and tendrils that tore into the convoy without hesitation. A guard's glider was ripped from under him, smashed against the pavement like a toy. Truck doors were peeled open as if they were made of tin, crates spilling out to reveal gleaming weapons. Peter moved in, webbing up two of the creature's arms mid-strike, but the symbiote didn't flinch. Instead, it used the web lines to yank him forward, slamming him against the side of a truck hard enough to rattle his teeth. Above, Norman's voice echoed through the rain, sharp and commanding. "Hold it steady." His glider screamed past Peter's head, strafing the symbiote with pumpkin bombs that detonated in bursts of green fire. The creature hissed and twisted, retreating into the shadows, but not before locking eyes with Norman. Eyes that seemed to recognize him, to register his challenge. Then it was gone, melting into the maze of side streets. Later that night, Peter returned to his apartment, every muscle aching. He found MJ sitting on the couch, her script on the coffee table. She'd been waiting. "You've been out every night," she said softly, "and you still come home looking like this." He wanted to tell her everything. That Norman was building an army, that the symbiote was loose, that he was barely holding it all together, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he told her it was just another bad week. She didn't believe him, but she didn't press. Meanwhile, Harry was making his own discoveries. His investigation into his father's activities led him to a set of freight elevators beneath Oscorp Tower, elevators that shouldn't have existed. He descended into the earth to find a sprawling underground complex, Norman's command center. Rows of goblin armor stood along the walls, each with subtle modifications for different combat roles. Monitors tracked activity across the city, red markers pinpointing gang activity, police patrols, and, disturbingly, Spider-Man's recent locations. In the center of it all was Norman, not surprised to see his son. Norman didn't bother with lies. He laid out his vision for Harry. A city under Osborn rule, safe because it was controlled, unified because it feared him. "The symbiote is the missing piece," Norman said, his eyes gleaming. "With it, nothing could challenge us. Not Spider-Man, not the police, not anyone." He offered Harry a place at his side. Harry's answer was immediate. "You're insane." Norman let him leave, but his smile said he didn't care. Harry would see the truth eventually. The symbiote's attacks escalated. It no longer struck at random. It began targeting Norman's supply lines, ambushing Goblin Guard patrols, even destroying Oscorp tech that had nothing to do with the gang war. Peter realized the host wasn't just following instinct. It was waging a campaign against Norman specifically. But the more Peter fought it, the more he noticed something terrifying. The creature was learning. It began countering his moves, anticipating his swings, even using pieces of the environment to its advantage in ways Otto never had. Finally, the creature made its boldest move yet. In the middle of the day, it attacked an Oscorp Tech Expo at the Javits Center. Crowds scattered as tendrils tore through the main exhibit hall, flipping display cases and smashing prototypes. Peter swung in just as Norman arrived on his glider, both of them converging on the symbiote in a blur of motion. The fight was pure chaos. Peter trying to disable the creature without killing the host. Norman trying to bring it down long enough to take it for himself. But the symbiote was too fast, too strong. It ripped Norman from his glider, slammed him into a display of sonic resonators, and left him dazed. Peter tried to cover the retreat, but the creature was already gone, vanishing into the city with the same fluid speed it always had. Norman's eyes burned with rage as he pulled himself to his feet. Next time, he growled, "I'll be ready." Peter knew what that meant, and that whatever came next would end with one of them dead. The city was bracing for another storm, but this one wasn't coming from the sky. For days, Peter had heard the rumors. Norman was setting a trap. Oscorp's experimental weapons division had quietly moved a sonic containment rig to one of the company's older testing facilities on the outskirts of Queens. It was the same technology Peter had seen at the expo, only bigger, stronger, and tuned to the symbiote's unique frequency. Norman wasn't going to destroy the creature. He was going to break it, make it his. Peter couldn't let that happen. He arrived at the facility under the cover of night, his suit damp from the light drizzle that had begun to fall. The building's interior was lit by a cold industrial glow, the sound of machinery echoing down the wide hallways. From the rafters, he spotted them, Goblin Guard troops stationed along catwalks, their gliders hovering in standby mode. They weren't here to keep people out. They were here to keep the symbiote in. The trap was already sprung. A dozen high-powered sonic emitters surrounded the center of the testing chamber, all trained on a reinforced steel platform. And there, writhing and clawing at its invisible prison, was the symbiote host. The black suit rippled with fury, tendrils whipping against the air as the emitters hummed. Norman stood before it in full Goblin King armor, his helmet retracted, the grin on his face wide and hungry. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Norman said, as Peter dropped into the chamber. "Raw power, pure potential, and soon it will be mine." "Norman, this thing will consume you," Peter said, his voice low but firm. "You won't control it, it'll control you." Norman chuckled. "I've already mastered something far more dangerous than this, Parker. You think I can't handle a little black goo?" Peter moved to disable the sonic array, but before he could act, Norman gave the signal. The emitters cut off. The symbiote lunged, ripping free of the weakened restraints, surging across the platform in a tide of black. Norman didn't flinch. He opened his arms and the creature engulfed him. The transformation was immediate and horrific. The goblin armor warped and twisted, its metallic surfaces melting into the symbiote's living matter. The jagged lines of the armor stretched into cruel, organic spikes, and the green glow of Norman's visor merged with the alien's inky sheen, creating an unholy hybrid of goblin and symbiote. His glider fused to his back, its wings now jagged and alive, flexing like the limbs of a predator. When he spoke, it was no longer just Norman's voice. It was layered, the goblin's madness and the symbiote's hunger in perfect harmony. "Now, Parker, we finish this." The battle tore through the facility. Norman struck with blinding speed, his symbiote-enhanced glider weaving through the air as his claws lashed out from every angle. Peter could barely keep up, dodging slashes that carved deep gouges into steel beams, ducking pumpkin bombs now laced with living tendrils that wrapped and constricted on impact. Every blow Norman landed shook Peter to his core. Every hit Peter managed to score seemed to heal instantly under the symbiote's shifting skin. Peter led him into the testing chamber's core, weaving between the massive sonic emitters. He fired web lines into control panels, forcing sparks to fly, and lured Norman closer. But Norman was relentless, his voice a constant taunt. "You could have ruled with me, Peter. Together we could have made this city ours." Peter gritted his teeth. "That's the difference between us, Norman. I don't want the city to be mine. I just want it safe." With one final leap, Peter hit the activation switch. The emitters roared to life, unleashing a deafening wave of sound. The symbiote screamed, its black surface bubbling and peeling away from Norman's armor in ragged strips. Norman staggered, clutching at the walls, his voice breaking between roars of rage and cries of pain. For a brief, fragile moment, Norman's human face emerged from beneath the writhing black mass. His eyes met Peter's, filled with a clarity Peter hadn't seen in years. "You should have let me die that night at the mansion," Norman said, his voice hoarse. "I could have been free." Peter shook his head, webbing the symbiote as it tried to retreat. "I don't kill, Norman, but I won't let you kill this city." The sonic barrage intensified, and with one last scream, the symbiote tore free entirely, collapsing into a quivering heap on the floor, before dissolving into nothing under the sustained sound waves. Norman, stripped of both the alien and his armor, collapsed into Peter's arms. "I was right about you," Norman whispered, his breath shallow. "Always better than me." Peter said nothing as Norman's hand went limp. He lowered the body to the floor, the weight of the moment pressing on him like the storm clouds above. Sirens wailed in the distance. Harry arrived moments later, skidding to a stop as he saw his father's body. His face twisted, not with rage, but with a deep, exhausted sorrow. "It ends here," Harry said quietly. "No more Osborn legacies. No more goblins." He met Peter's eyes for a long moment before turning away. A week later, Peter stood in the cemetery, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain. He placed a rose on Uncle Ben's grave, the stone worn smooth by time. "It wasn't about revenge," he said softly. "It never was. It's about what I choose to do, every day, and I'll keep choosing." He pulled his mask on, turned toward the city, and leapt into the sky.